Well, hello, and welcome back. I am AJ O'Neill. I'll be your instructor for tonight's Beyond Code session. And tonight, we're going to be talking about, oh, not that. Goodness, where did it go? All right. We're going to be talking about HTML. Now, this is kind of part 3 in the HTML mini course. And we've talked about Markdown, which is kind of where I recommend that you start just so you can be quick and productive. And we talked about HTML as a language. Both of those videos are in the description, link there. So now what we're going to do is kind of go over the same stuff that we went over in the Markdown cheat sheet, which is what I've got up right here. And you'll notice it's going to be very similar to what I have in the HTML cheat sheet. I've made these fairly one-to-one. And if you've got any questions, I do have both the Twitch and YouTube comments open. So if you are watching live right now, feel free to hit me up there. And otherwise, hit me up on @_beyondcode on Twitter if you're watching this not live. With that all out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and if at any point first of all, I recommend get to gist.github.com so you can be taking some notes. And if at any point you get that aha moment where something clicks for you, go ahead and give this a thumbs up while you're watching here. Okay, so the link to this is in the description. And what I'm going to show you, we've already talked about kind of the syntax of HTML, where it's a very simple syntax. It's basically greater than and less than brackets, and these things that are tags is what is the item that's in these brackets, and then we have attributes, and then we have text, and that's pretty much it. And these things can be nested. So I want to go over the things that you're likely to use for a web page, and I want to distinguish web page from web app, because we're not talking about all the things that you'll do with HTML. We're talking specifically if you were writing a blog article, if you were creating a piece of content, these are the types of things that you would use. All right. So, and again, since you've seen most of these in Markdown, I won't, well, I guess I do need to go into the details of it all. So a heading is typically two components. A heading looks like this. It just makes the text bigger and bolder. And it has two components. One is the heading itself, which is what makes it big and bold. And the second is what's known as an anchor tag. So when we have a heading, take a look here, you've got H1 is the largest, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. And we'll see, actually, we'll go ahead and take an example. Yeah, you can see what these headings look like. Now, the style of HTML is going to be different depending on what the style sheet of the site that you're working on is. So all of the styling, meaning the colors, the exact sizing, all of that is being defined because we're looking at this page on GitHub, and GitHub applies some styling to it. The HTML itself is really just the text, but what we are talking about here are things that do have default styles, meaning that if you were to just open this in a browser, and in fact, perhaps I can do this here. Let me see if I can move that over. If we were to just go up here and delete the styles from the page, if I can find them real quick. Oh gosh, there's quite a few of them, aren't there? So I may not be able to do that. Well, let's give it a try. Let me just delete the head. There we go. So we'll look at this without any styles so that you can kind of see this is what the browser's default looks like for these things. We'll go back to having it pretty in a second. But a heading 3 will look like this. A strong will be bold. An M for emphasis will be italics. So on and so forth. So let's just scroll through here. This is what all this stuff looks like without any styling, just what Safari presents it as. So we're just looking at raw HTML without any CSS, or rather only the CSS that's available in the browser. You can see that it's very, very plain. So I'm going to go back up to the top, and we are going to undelete that. There we are. So now we have our styles back, just so that we're clear on what's what. Okay, so we got headings. We got inline formatting. Inline formatting, there's basically two types of tags or blocks in HTML. There's inline and there is block style. So inline are things that basically apply to text itself. So the most fundamental piece that we have is a text node. So basically anything that you type in HTML is a text node unless you happen to type something that is intentional. So if I just, the cat jumps on the keyboard, that's all HTML text nodes. Now, if I happen to use a tag, like a span, span is the other base tag in HTML. It actually doesn't mean anything. Span just gives you the ability to add styles through classes, which we'll go into later. And we're not really going to touch on this too much now, but I did want to introduce it because it is one of there's three base components, which is a text node, a span, and a div. So we'll talk about div a little later, but it doesn't do anything. It just gives you the ability to put a class on something. And classes don't do anything in HTML. When you use CSS, these classes mean a class of style. So think of it like it's classy. The element's got class, right? So strong is bold, EM is italics, del is deleted, and it looks like I have a little typo here I need to fix because these should not be all deleted out. So I must have, I'll fix that in a minute. Then we have sup for superscript, and I'll show an example of that in a second. Sub for subscript. So these we don't have in Markdown. These are new. Del we have in Markdown, or strike. It's sometimes called strike. Code block, and then keyboard. So keyboard we do not have in Markdown, but we do have it in HTML. So all of these elements that we had in Markdown, this is what they look like when they're represented as HTML. Just ignore the strike throughs there. I'm going to have to fix that. And HTML pretty much all begin with an ampersand. So ampersand is a special character that is an escape character. So Markdown we had backslash, and it was very simple. Backslash just switched something from either being not special or making it special. HTML is a little bit more complex. So the ampersand is a special symbol by itself. So technically it's supposed to be escaped. So if you want to write an ampersand that is not part of an escape sequence, you use ampersand amp to create an ampersand. Ampersand LT means less than, and they all end with a semicolon. This is actually very important. So this is what an escape sequence looks like in HTML. There's an ampersand and then telling it what you want to present. So if you wanted to write a literal less than symbol, this is how you do it in HTML. If you wanted to give examples of HTML in HTML, like what I've done here, where I have this less than, in the HTML, it's this escape sequence and LT for less than, and then the semicolon. Semicolon, remember, is not a colon. It's not a comma. It is a semicolon. It's a period with a comma underneath, or a comma with a period on top, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, then we have another special character, which is non-breaking space. We'll talk about that later, but essentially, white space in HTML doesn't matter. You can put 100 new lines, you can put 100 spaces, and it's only going to count as one space. It's not even going to count as a new line. So the non-breaking space is a pretty important one. And then for all of the emojis and all of the different characters that might be represented in HTML, oh, I forgot to put the semicolon at the end of there. I'll have to fix that too. But they have some code that you basically just have to go look up or you have to find, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So block formatting, there are a couple of different types of blocks in HTML, but the main one is div, and div is much like span. Span doesn't mean anything. It's just a placeholder for you to put classes on for things that are in line, meaning that if there's a line of text, a span can go in the line of text and it doesn't break the line of text. What's different about div is div will break a line of text. So if you have, well, depending on what its style is given, but like I said, the style that we give it is going to be completely arbitrary, and that's CSS, that's not actually HTML. But if we just put, so I said here a box area. I should have put two of these back to back so you could see. But if we put two box areas next to each other, the natural order is for them to stack one on top of another. So if I put the letter A in one of these box areas, and then box in one of these box areas, and then area in one of these box areas. If I wrap them all in divs, we would actually see a box area on 3 separate lines. Block quote is another block element, and it will make things look like a quote, or that's the suggested style. Before I said there actually are very few hard and fast rules in HTML. Almost everything is arbitrary, but the browser will by default, which is good. Let me see if I can actually redo. Can I redo that delete? No, I can't. That's too bad. I'm going to actually, let me try opening up this. Can I redo it? Yeah, I can. Let's see what a block quote looks like. Yeah, so it's just indentation. It doesn't get any fancy styling. If we take away the styles, block quote, the only thing special that it does is indents. So let's go back here. We have, let me go back up. I went down too far. We have lists. So it's a little bit more verbose than what we have in Markdown, but UL stands for unordered list. LI stands for list item. And so if we can put items in a UL. Now in Markdown, we just did a dash if we wanted it an unordered list, and then we did a 1 period or an A period or something like that if we wanted it to be an ordered list, either numerically or alphabetically or whatever. So Markdown's very intuitive. There are some ways that you can specify what type of list you want it to be. Essentially, UL or OL is the main thing. So, and the reason I made this cheat sheet is whatever you see on the right, what's on the left is what makes it. Something that you can come to, you can kind of scroll down, see what's working, and then find out how you'd make it for yourself. If you copy and paste the stuff on the right, you're good to go. This is one that I don't use too often, but you'll see this in people's documentation on GitHub, and so I think that it's good to include for that reason. But it just gives you a little interactive element that has this drop down, and this is one of the rare elements of HTML that actually has a predefined behavior that is CSS, because most things, as you can see, when we undo here, we redo, we get rid of the CSS, and there's very few things that have predefined behavior, but the details element is one of them, and it just allows us to give a summary, the details of the summary. So let me go ahead and put our styles back here. Okay, and now scroll back to the correct position. A table is much more powerful in HTML, but it is a lot more verbose. It's a table tag, a table head tag, a table body tag. TR tag is table row, TH is table header, TD is table data. So all of these things are, it's more verbose, but there are situations where you can get more sophistication out of a table in HTML than you can in Markdown, especially when it comes to nesting. You can't nest a table inside of a table in Markdown. That's one of the limitations. You can nest a table inside of a table in HTML. In fact, back in the day before CSS, all web pages were designed by putting tables inside of tables. Amazon.com was that way for many, many years after we had CSS. Links use an anchor tag. So I introduced the anchor tag when we talked about a heading. A heading is, if we hover over this link, we can see, and that anchor actually changes the URL. So we can see it now says pound heading. If I click on something in the page, what makes it go to that heading is the fact that it has an anchor tag. That's what the links are. They're anchor tags. So let me go back here. And if we put an anchor tag that is an HTTP scheme, that's what it's called when it has HTTPS : that's called the scheme, the HTTPS scheme of the URL. You're familiar with seeing URLs. So if we give a href is hyperlink reference. Hyperlink reference is an HTTP or HTTPS scheme, then that is a link that will go external to where we're at. You give the reference of where you want the link to go, and then you give the text is inside of the anchor tag of what you want it to display as. If we want to show an image on the screen, now this is something that most people don't know actually. You are supposed to put a picture tag and then put an IMG tag inside of it. And then the IMG tag would have the SRC, which stands for source, and you'd give it a link to the image. So if I just open up this link, this is the Amazon logo image right there. Essentially that's the download to the Amazon logo. And then you also are supposed to, this is supposedly required, you're required to have alt text on a link. If you want to do inline code, so for example, I am trying to show, what I want to show is HTML, I can wrap it in a code block. Now the catch is that if I want to show HTML, it looks kind of nasty, and less than symbols. Okay. I can also do not just inline code, but I can do block code. And block code is done with a pre-tag. So pre stands for pre-formatted text. So I've got pre-formatted text, and then I put code inside, and pre-formatted makes it a block where the spaces are not ignored. Because like I said before, typically in HTML, spaces are ignored. If we use a pre-tag, it says this text is pre-formatted, don't ignore the spaces. What it does not ignore, it does not ignore HTML. You put HTML in there, the HTML is still going to render. Oh, excuse me. So we have to use escapes in HTML. So again, and less than. So if I wanted to, if I want to print out HTML, I have to escape it. I put it in a pre-tag and a pre and a code. Looks nice. Okay, we're going to talk about nesting in a bit, and then horizontal rule is just kind of an oddball, but it typically gives you a horizontal rule. So if you want to do some separation on the page, let me see what it shows like here. Yeah, so here it looks like a very thin line. This can be styled. Oops. There we go. Typically it is. All right, so this table, if you were to look at this table is actually mostly written in Markdown, but it's demonstrative of what the HTML is, and it looks, whether you look at these tables in HTML or in Markdown, it looks rough. HTML is a bit harder to understand. So I recommend you just kind of use a cheat sheet like this where you can find, okay, what's the thing I'm trying to do? Okay, I'm trying to make a list. What's a list like? Okay, this is what a list is like. And you can kind of play around from there. And just like the Markdown cheat sheet, I have tons of examples of different variations as we go throughout here. So just to highlight a couple of things that you don't get in Markdown that you do get in HTML. Details, at least on GitHub, is not supported in Markdown, but you do get details in HTML. So if you want one of these little arrow mabobs that shows a summary text, and then when you click on it, it shows full text, that is an HTML only thing. Keyboard, KBD keyboard, the keyboard tag. If you want to be able to have something look like a key on a keyboard, that is something that's supported in HTML, and many sites will have some sort of style for their web pages for that. Superscript and subscript. These are not available in Markdown. You have to use the HTML. Now remember, you can use HTML inside of Markdown. So any of the things that you don't get in Markdown, you can use HTML to get them. If you're using a site like GitHub, there are some restrictions, which we'll cover in a second. And then, yeah, the div, the span, and class. So there's no div, there's no span, and therefore there's no class in Markdown. If you want to use classes, if you want to use custom styling, that requires going into HTML. And that's probably about it for the things that you'd want for a blog. So if you are comfortable with Markdown and you're loving Markdown, these are really the only things that you need to know in addition. Let Markdown do the other stuff for you. If you need a complex table, you'll have to put it in HTML. Otherwise, just use Markdown. But anyway, let's go ahead and we'll go through the rest of this, I think, pretty quickly, because we kind of did the deep dive as we went through the top level cheat sheet here, which basically has everything that you'd ever use. Well, almost everything that you'd ever use for a web page. We're not covering forms. We're not covering semantic HTML that would be used for research papers and screen readers. We're just covering the practical things that you'd use for blogs and web pages. Okay, so These are just the different styles of headings, gives you an example of what it looks like. Notice with all of them I put an anchor tag because the anchor tag is what allows you to click on it and allows it to be linked to, so that you can link to the middle of a page of a document. If you do not put the anchor tag around your heading, then somebody cannot link to that part of the page. So it's really, really important, and generally in Markdown this is done for you automatically. But if you're writing HTML by hand, it's really important not to forget to do the anchor tags. And the anchor tag needs to have an ID and an href. And the href has a pound. This is defined. This is what it has to be. This is the way the browser expects it and understands it. It has to be a pound, and then it has to be the name of the ID. So you're going to say ID equals, and typically you go with whatever the name of the header is. So if the header is green eggs and ham, then your ID would be green eggs ham, because the ampersand would just get collapsed into a single hyphen, and so you end up with a double hyphen there, and we might have an example of that later. And then the href would be just pound, and then whatever the ID is, which again, we kind of call this slugifying. You slugify the title or the section of the document, and you make that the ID. Now there's some drawbacks to using IDs, so I recommend that you always have a hyphen in your ID, and perhaps even start it with a hyphen. But there are some issues that can pop up if you use an ID singularly without a hyphen in it, which we'll go into when we talk about JavaScript more. But essentially it creates JavaScript objects, which is kind of a weird behavior, but it happens. So yeah, all the headings, H1 through H6, they're all the same thing. They're just smaller and lighter, typically, is the way that they get styled. I wanted to escape an H1. Well, I don't even know I put this here. I'll have to take that out too. But anytime you want to escape HTML to be able to display an HTML tag, it's and LT semicolon. So ampersand less than. Emojis, there's something you need to put in your HTML document in the head section, which we haven't really talked about yet. So store this away for later. But if you want to be able to use emojis or international characters, you have to have a meta char set equals UTF-8 in your head. Now, if you're doing just pages, if you're just doing content work, whatever platform is allowing you to input the HTML has already done this for you. GitHub already has this tag put in there. You don't worry about, and the type of stuff we're talking about, you don't worry about head versus body. All of this stuff is body stuff right now. We can go into the head stuff later, but I do just want to have that note there that if you don't have char set equals UTF-8, then the emojis may not show up correctly. I think they do when you use escape codes, but if you were to just copy and paste them, they would not. So some other things, there's, like I said, you kind of just have to look up. You have to look up what the escape code is. And sometimes you can just copy and paste it and it'll work fine. It's better if you use the escape codes, but if it's difficult for you to figure out what the escape code is, to search it out, and it does work to put in the emoji as is, just be happy. There are a bunch of named escapes. So these escape codes pretty much look random. They're based on a lookup table that you just have to look up. There are a bunch of name ones that you could memorize, like and copy, and trade, and dag. So we can see there's a copyright symbol, there's a degree mark, there's a trademark symbol, stuff like that. And then, of course, we already talked about this, the general escapes, the ampersand escape, the less than and greater than escape. The non-breaking space, here's a good example of that. So if we put a bunch of spaces in HTML, the way it renders as a single space, we could even put new lines, it's going to render as a single space. If we use the ampersand NBSP for non-breaking space, it will make the spaces real. And it will also make, it has two effects. One, it makes the spaces real. So if you put 4 spaces, it keeps 4 spaces. The other thing that it does is that it will not break between those spaces. So if I were to try to collapse this, which is not collapsing anyway, but you've seen before where the text collapses. If you put non-breaking spaces in between something, the text does not collapse. So that is important to note. And if you want a good reference, I put up a couple of references here to where you can look up these escape codes for the different symbols and types of things that you might want to use. So there's 3 of them right there. And then once we get into JavaScript, or I'll actually show you this right now. So if I open up the inspector console and I just copy and paste this bit here, let me go into the console. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Let's see if I can get that bigger. Maybe clear some of this stuff out. There we go. If I just paste this in here and I copy and paste this emoji with whatever emoji that I want and hit enter, there's the HTML escape code. So if you've got the emoji and you don't want to go look up what the code is, or you're having trouble looking up what the code is because it's nearly impossible to look up the codes, you can just take that snippet, paste it into the console of a browser's inspector tab, and then what you'll get out is exactly what you need for the escape code. Inline formatting, we kind of already talked about this, so I'm not going to go over it too much again. These are just a bunch of examples, just different ways that you can use it. Note that you can put tags in the middle of text. So just like we could with Markdown with the stars, you can combine tags together. So you can have a strong tag inside of an EM tag, or an EM tag inside of a strong tag. You do need to close them in the correct order. So if I open up an EM last, I have to close it first. If I open up a strong first, I have to close it last. So they do have to be in the right order. Let's see, is there anything else that we want to cover there? Yeah, here's what they are all nested. If you do not want to put a space, if you want to visually represent the code that you're working on decently well, you want it to not just look like one big giant long line. You want to put some breaks in there. If you put an enter after the closing bracket, then you will get a space in your output, because a new and 10 spaces are converted to 1 space, 10 new lines are converted to 1 space. So if you don't want any spaces, what you can do is all of the different parts of a tag can be on different lines. So you can take the closing part of the tag. So here's the code tag. Note that I didn't put a closing greater than sign right here. I put it on the next line. So now there's no space in between that and all. So there's no leading space in my little block here. That's a little trick, important thing to know. And let's see, block formatting. We talked about block formatting pretty much. Again, these are just different examples. One thing that's important to note, this isn't particularly about block formatting, this is just about classes. We'll go into this later, but something to store away. You can have new lines in the quotes. So you don't have to put, you'll see a lot of times people put everything one after the other, and it gets kind of long, and it gets kind of messy and hard to read. You can actually use new lines in a class, but we'll talk about that later. That's not what we're talking about today. So we got paragraphs. That's another type of block. We talked about that in Markdown. In HTML, it's just a p tag. And you put p on either side of it, opening p and close p. And then that gives you typically extra space in between lines of text. And if you wanted to put just a single space, that's what a break is for. So I'm not sure what break classifies as, because it's kind of an inline thing that causes a break to happen. But yeah, I think it's considered an inline element. You can have breaks inside of a span, I think. Not sure about that. But block quote, we already talked about that. Oh, I need to, this is copied over from the Markdown, need to update that. And you can have a block quote inside of a block quote. So this is true with many things. You can put lists inside of block quotes. You can put block quotes inside of lists. Almost everything is nestable. And then we talked about the pre. So this is an example of a pre. In the ideal case, will preserve white space. There are some cases where it does not, but the general rule is that it preserves white space. It can be styled to not do that, which in this case I had to hack this example because the way GitHub styles the pre inside of a table, it didn't preserve the space in that particular case. Anyway, we've got lists. So you can have nested lists. You can open up an unordered list, and then inside of a list item, you can have an unordered list as part of a list item that has its own list items inside. So this is just nesting, run-of-the-mill nesting, nothing too scary here. It's just we're taking the unordered list and we're adding it as a nested item of a list item. So that gives us this. We can do the same thing with numbered, that's ordered lists. There are some, I linked to some other cheat sheets. There are some ways that you can tell it start at 5 instead of starting at 1 and stuff like that. Yeah, just more mix and match there. Tables. This is what a table looks like. There is, before the days of CSS, one of the things that is a remnant, because table is also kind of a special element that doesn't follow all the modern rules. There is a alignment that you can use, align equals, and so you can justify text in a table left, center, or right. And this is how Markdown does it. This is what Markdown produces when you... Okay, links and images. There's a couple things to note here. We talked about, you can use a normal URL, and if you use target equals _ blank, that will cause it to open up in a new page. So normally when you click on a link, it redirects that tab to that link. Now, because the way GitHub works, it strips out lots of attributes. It's very, very strict about what it allows in HTML. So that target equals blank gets stripped out. But if it had been effective, then when I click on this, it would open up a new tab and it would take me to that tab. Okay. We can use links that are relative to the current site, either begin with a slash, a ./, or a pound. We already saw how the pound works. It's what we typically use for headings. We can have mail to. If you want it to open up the mail client, you can put a mail to. In many cases, the Gmail website is registered as the mail client in the browser. So when you click on an email link, it'll open up Gmail. In my case, I don't think I have Gmail registered as the mail client in Safari, so the default is to open up the mail app on the computer, so I'm not going to click on that. You can also do telephone. For security reasons, GitHub does not allow all the different types of links. So if we were to render this on our own website, we could get these links to work, but GitHub sanitizes them and strips them out. But if you use tel:, then that becomes a clickable telephone. This is really nice on mobile, where you want somebody to be able to call the phone number for the office. Put it in an anchor tag. Put a tel: prefix, and then you do need to use the international format, so it does need to start with +1. But then you can have clickable phone numbers. This is something you should not do, and it is stripped out of GitHub, and it has lots of security considerations that you need to be aware of later on. But you can use a JavaScript URL and it will run JavaScript. It's not doing it here because GitHub strips that out. Another cool thing is that basically every app on your computer has a protocol. Some of them are actually registered as a standard. So Skype : Spotify : IRC : tons of web protocols that have existed over the decades, just like HTTPS and mail to and tel, tons of them have their own standardized protocol. And so if I wanted to link to something in Spotify, this is how I would do it. I would say Spotify : search : and I'd give whatever the search term I want is. And if someone were to click this link, even though it's been stripped out here on GitHub, if someone were to click it on another, if it hadn't been stripped out, that would open up Spotify on their computer and open it to the search page. So lots of things that you can do with links and get kind of clever. Picture tag, we already talked about that. You can also set the width. That's another thing you can do. This is a remnant of the pre-CSS days that width is available. Generally, you set sizing of things in CSS, but sometimes it's convenient to just put a width. One thing to note is this, if you have a 5 megabyte image and you set the width to be 48 pixels because you want it to be nice and small and fit on the page, it will still download all 5 megabytes. So bear that in mind. And then we can wrap a link around a picture to make a picture something that we can click on that will take us somewhere. So this is going to take us to Amazon. We can put links around lots of different things. Whoops, let me get back here. We can put links around lots of different types of elements. We could draw a blue box and we can put a link around it, but it's very common to put links around pictures. This is the list of the custom URL schemes. And then last thing is just a couple of the rules of HTML that we need to be aware of. I think we've already covered these. So almost any inline element can nest inside any other element. So an EM is an inline element. It operates on just text. And we can have an EM inside of a strong. We could have an EM inside of a div. We could have an EM inside of most, but not all, other elements. But what we must do is we must open and close them in the right order. So whatever it's last in, first out is the ordering. So first in is strong, next in is EM. EM happens to be the last in needs to be first out. So we should close EM, but oh no, we didn't. So this is wrong. Another rule, almost any block element can nest in another block element. So we can have a pre inside of a div. We can have a block quote inside of a pre, or we can have a pre inside of a block quote. We can have a div inside of a block quote. They can be nested in pretty much any order. We can have a table inside of a pre. We can have a pre inside of a table, so on and so forth. So all the block elements, the things that take up vertical space, essentially, the things that break between text. If I were to put hello and then a table and then world, it would break the text. Those are block elements. So any of those can be nested anyway, but what we cannot do is we cannot take an inline element, something that applies just to text, and then put a block element inside of it. It will have unexpected consequences. The page will render, but it will not render necessarily in the way that you expect. Or if it does render in the way you expect, it's just because you expect things weird. Okay, and then, of course, the great and terrible thing about HTML is that all of the rules are broken, and they're more of what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. So just be aware that there are always exceptions in HTML. It is not a very well standardized and defined language, or rather, it is well standardized and defined, but its standardization and definition is based on years and years of not being well standardized and defined. So there's tons of exceptions and corner cases and edge cases that are now part of the standard. And then if you want to take a look at some other cheat sheets, the reason that I created this is so that we can look and have something that we can just kind of copy and paste of, okay, I see what it looks like on the right. If that's the thing I'm trying to do, let me look on the left. How is that put together? There are a bunch of other cheat sheets out there, and they are going to cover more of the tags and the properties of the tags in depth, but they don't give examples. That's why I created this one. So here are some of the ones that I took a look at, and I thought these ones are particularly good. And then there's some other resources in here too. So I hope that this was helpful to you. If it was, please go ahead and give this a thumbs up. You can subscribe if you want more like this. I do live streams every weekday, as well as put up the edited versions on the Beyond Code Bootcamp channel. Links to all of that is in the description. I would love to know, particularly helpful for you, and I'd also love to know what are some of the questions that you have, things that you want to know more about. You can either leave comments in the doobly-doo down below. No, that's not the doobly-doo. The doobly-doo is the doobly-doo. It's the comments section. You can leave your comments and questions in the comments section down below, or you can hit me up at _BeyondCode on Twitter. I would love to hear from you. And we are going to continue on with this mini course. I'm going to be talking about, as I said before, we're going to talk about probably forms next. And then, or we might go into Semantic HTML next to give me a little bit more time to get a good cheat sheet for forms. We'll see. But tomorrow we're either going to be going into cheat sheets. And Semantic HTML is something you need to be aware of, but it is so huge that we're not going to do something like this where we go through and try to cover the majority of it. These things that I've listed here are the things that have default styles by the browser and things that you will use very, very commonly for any type of content. Although, you might prefer to use Markdown where you can. When we talk about semantic HTML, it's a different beast. And forms is something that we can have a cheat sheet kind of like this for, where there's a limited number of forms, probably fewer form elements than what we have here, and it's a little bit easier to kind of go through them and hit some of the highlights of it. Anyway, with all that said, thanks for tuning in. You have a wonderful night, and I will catch you later. Adios. Of course not. Of course not. Why would... Got my hotkeys working the other thing, now they don't work in this thing. Of course. Come on. Come on. You know what to do here. Don't give me a hard time.